Let's bring in roll call columnist Jon Allen, who joins us here on set. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Vlad.
So you just heard there Senator Graham talking about what he thinks the qualities in his mind are important to being the next FBI director, being loyal to the law. Look, the president's, there have been reports that the president demanded that former FBI Director Jim Comey be loyal. The White House is trying to parse it, and the president in that interview with Fox said, you know, loyal to the country. But there's a lot of people, first of all, Director
Which
Comey,
is an odd thing to ask the sitting FBI director.
He's been doing that job for a while. He's probably proven his loyalty to the country.
The FBI director is generally a 10-year commitment. That is to ensure that there are no politics involved. Some people have criticized Comey for saying he was maybe a little too fastidious when it came to the law and to the reputation of the FBI, that to people who know him, it doesn't sound like what Director Comey would say, that he would be loyal or to Donald Trump. Senator Graham is talking about loyal to the law. Wasn't Jim Comey that?
Yeah, I think Jim Comey was loyal to the law. He was not always loyal to procedure. He was not always loyal to regulation. And so I think there are a lot of people who could see reasons to fire Jim Comey. The problem is that Jim Comey was fired while he was conducting an investigation into Donald Trump. And specifically, we heard the president say that the entire concocted story of why he was fired isn't true, and that in fact the president just wanted to fire him and basically, I think, acknowledged that it was over Russia. So, you know, going forward from there, you have to try to find somebody who you know, who can be loyal to the law, who can continue with investigations, or if you're Donald Trump, maybe that's not what you want. That there's a huge tension point there.
But you know, so one of the names that has been discussed is Mike Rogers. He's a former FBI agent, so there's some people who like the fact that he's a former agent, but he's also a former Republican congressman. Would that be considered somebody, because he's a street guy, he was a street FBI agent, that he might know the needs and the requirements of the agency better? But
or should he just stay away from politicians altogether?
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Senator Graham thinks he should stay away from politicians. Sometimes politicians have the easiest path through the Senate. I mean, John Cornyn is the Republican whip in the Senate. If he can't get the majority of votes together, then no one would be able to. You know, I think Mike Rogers is somebody who's well respected. Sort of across the board. I think Democrats have liked and respected and worked with him. I wouldn't be shocked if it was him, but you know, the easiest choice here is to simply elevate Andrew McCabe, the number 2.
But that typically doesn't happen, does it?
It doesn't. Yeah, that's not something that typically happens. But this might be an unusual circumstance.
Right. Right.
Merrick Garland, that was a name that was
another name that was tossed out, yeah.
Right. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader on another network, through one of his aides, said that he would be supportive of that. The 2 Utah senators said they wanted to see that. I think they're trying to get some cover for Orrin Hatch having recommended Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court and then backed out on him. I think it's unlikely that Merrick Garland would get that job. And of course, if you're Donald Trump, the last person on earth that you want is somebody who just got jammed by your party.
Yeah, right. So just to add to the brouhaha over Comey being fired, we have this tweet from Donald Trump basically saying, well, you know, I'm sure Comey wants to, Comey better make sure there aren't any tapes recording anything, you know, before he leaks anymore. And then we are hearing from the New York Times that that if Comey does testify before Congress, he wants to do it in public, not behind closed doors. Where do you see this going?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to predict where Jim Comey's thought process is, right? Like if he does something in private, maybe there's more that he can say, but he obviously doesn't want to do that. If he goes and testifies in public, I think he'll still be somewhat limited.
So the question of tapes, the president tweets about tapes, and he puts the word tapes in quotation marks. Look, many presidents have recorded conversations. FDR did it. We've all laughed at listening to some of the tapes of LBJ and his very colorful language. We've got tapes of Kennedy.
Richard Nixon.
Missing tapes of Richard Nixon.
Missing tapes of Richard Nixon. But in the last 20 or 30 years, most presidents have not recorded conversations. If the Congress subpoenas the tapes of President Trump, and he says,
if there are tapes.
If there are tapes. But my question was going to be, if he says, well, no, there aren't any, I was just saying that. We've gotten to a point where we would just go, oh, well, it's the president being colorful and just saying what he does on Twitter. We shouldn't take anything from it. But is that the way we should be as a nation and even as reporters?
I'm not sure people would say, oh, that's the president being colorful. I think that would get pressed. I think if Congress tried to subpoena something that exists, or there's a question of whether it exists, you'd probably see that play out in the courts. I think the president would claim executive privilege.
Which is what President Nixon did.
And many, many years from now, we would find out.
We are hearing about a possible shuffle at the White House. And at least when we talked to Major Garrett earlier this morning, he said it's probably going to be in the communications department. They seem, when the stuff hits the fan, as they say, they are the ones that tend to be on the hot seat. Is it time for a reset here? Certainly over the last week, we've seen juggling communications people. We didn't see Sean Spicer, but we saw a lot of other people speaking on behalf of the president and stepping all over each other.
I mean, the biggest problem is the president in terms of a communication strategy or executing on legislative strategy. I mean, he's the one that's listing back and forth. He can't fire himself. The communication shop always gets blamed for not carrying out the communications well enough.
Right.
I would not be surprised to see a shakeup there. I wouldn't be surprised to see a shakeup really anywhere over the next several weeks.
Although, I would encourage our viewers to do a little research on, because in this talk of Nixonian, President Nixon's press secretary, a guy named Ron Ziegler, the guy who first went up there in front of reporters and said this is a third-rate burglary and what are you guys all getting worked up over? And he stayed with Nixon pretty much until the very end. In fact, that famous shot of Nixon getting on Marine One, Ziegler was in the helicopter with him. It's just an interesting history of a man who didn't come from a background of journalism, who was as embattled as Sean Spicer has been over the last couple of months. And there was a lot of talk that he was going to go. He never did.
Well, I mean, the problem with getting rid of Spicer is you got to find somebody who's willing to take that job.
Right.
Right.
And the biggest input, what makes your job so difficult, are not the reporters. It's the president.
It's your boss.
But I think he's done a fairly good job of playing to that audience of one. You know what I mean? Like, the reporters don't love dealing with him, but I think Donald Trump has, I think it would be hard pressed to find anybody who's been more loyal or attempted to be more to follow the instructions than Sean has.
If he decided to get rid of Reince Priebus, Reince Priebus, who would take that job?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a tough call. I mean, he might bring in somebody from the business world. He might try to give, like a Gary Cohn, who's at the National Economic Council, somebody like that, to try to manage in the way that a business manager might. But government's different than business, and I think Donald Trump's finding that out.
So the president is getting ready to take his first foreign trip. He's going to meet a number of world leaders. Do you think that some of this internal turmoil is going to have an impact on his effectiveness overseas?
I mean, I think Americans should be hopeful that President Trump's domestic woes will not translate onto the international stage, and that he will go out and have like a good international week or so, and show the world that he's a little different than I think some people have expected.
All right, we'll see how it plays out. Jon Allen, always good to have you.
My pleasure, guys.